In 1881, a prairie town nearly went to war over a road. One man tried to own the land, the church, the rail, and eventually the money. What began as a prairie outpost of 200 souls will, by 2050, become a metropolis. This is a wild ride of capitalist settlers, bold and disastrous planning decisions, courageous feats and bitter rivalry. Told through my hand-drawn maps, a lightbox, historical photographs, and newspaper clippings. Before any American pioneer arrived, there was a creek, and the Winona people moved along it as part of their vast but shrinking territory. Along the creek lay a quiet cove with 2 small beaches. The water was calm with abundance of fish. Early explorers crossed here on horseback, at its narrowest point, travelling from north to south. Realizing the potential of the cove, they cut timber from nearby trees and built a simple dock. The trail was dangerous, and stories of violent attacks travelled with those who used it. The explorers fished here and hurled their catch back north. They named the route the Winona Trade Path. Time went on, and early settlers began to set up camp. Nothing permanent, mostly tents and scattered campfires. This stretch became known as Winona Bend. Rocks clung to the shoreline, and the current ran fast where the river narrowed into a tight curve upstream. Most settlers knew not to swim or attempt a crossing here, but one fateful day, John, aged 13, and his 2 younger brothers were swept from the rocks and drowned. The settlement paid homage to them by naming the outcrop in their honour. Soon, a settler with money arrived, a beguiling pioneer with a moustache too refined for this stretch of prairie, and a family of 12, a good Christian, hard-working and literate. His name, and do not forget it, is Mr. Theodore Silas Blainey of Kansas City. Having secured several acres along the creek through early filings, he upgraded the timber dock and laid claim to it. He even renamed the cove after himself. At the crossing of the Cedar River, he erected a timber sign warning travelers of the ford and vowed that one day he would build a proper bridge. Blainey began hiring men from the Winona settlement for protection, for labor, and for company. And together they pushed inland from the river, cutting a rough path through the prairie grass. 2 men grew especially close to him, Davenport and Henderson. In a running joke, Blainey named the wide flat prairie after Davenport's broad nose. He called it the Davenport Flats. The party eventually reached another creek and found a weathered post driven into the ground. It read, "Don't waste your time, no gold here." Blainey called it a bluff. Rumours of alluvial gold had drifted through the territory before, and he was not one to ignore them. He left Henderson and a small group of men to test the creek while he pressed farther south, continuing to cut brush and extend the trail. Over the months, more settlers arrived at the crossroads, and the region's first permanent structure was built, a coach inn, managed by a man who had married one of Blainey's daughters. Soon, Henderson's prospering camp abandoned the creek and joined the growing settlement near the inn. Rough streets began to form, lined with timber shacks and crude dwellings. The town square emerged early, and not for noble reasons. A hastily built set of gallows was raised for the public execution of the inn's manager after Blainey caught Johnstone in betrayal, not with a stranger, but with another of Blainey's daughters. The sentence was carried out swiftly, under the authority of the county sheriff, though many knew those who truly drove this desire. At that time, the county sheriff's circuit passed through the region only twice a year, leaving much of the day-to-day order in the hands of whoever held the most land and influence. The gallows stood for months afterward, the rope left hanging as a warning. In time, the site became a permanent landmark in the settlement's memory, nicknamed Cheater's Corner. If you want my advice, never plant your seed in the house of Blainey. More streets and timber dwellings began to rise. The Winona Trail, once dusty and narrow, was absorbed into the emerging town. Horse troughs appeared along the road, candlelit flickered in windows at night, and a sense of permanence began to settle in. Blainey believed that if outside money arrived unchecked, his influence would weaken. So before other wealthy men could establish themselves, he financed the construction of several buildings, all under his ownership. Fees from dock use, land sales, and freight storage quietly filled his coffers long before the railroad arrived. He appointed his most loyal friends and workers to manage the new general store, blacksmith shop, post office, saloon, and livery stable. Everything a settlement of 100 souls required, and more for passing travelers. He named the stretch Main Street, and he was pleased. This was his town, a place to root his Christian values. A church was built, and attendance was strongly expected every Sunday. On Sabbath mornings, the streets lay quiet. A schoolhouse followed, intended for his children and any child baptized into the church. He petitioned the state for educational funds, and in time they were granted. Blainey's two most loyal men grew restless and wanted land of their own to raise families. Blainey was cautious, but he agreed, on his terms. He arranged for Davenport to acquire farmland to the east, on the condition that he safeguard the docks and keep order along the river road, particularly amongst rustlers or unrest along the frontier. Davenport worked the land hard and steadily built up his farm. To the west, Henderson was granted acreage near the creek and the former prospecting camp, though notably excluding a giant oak that stood alone in the prairie, where Blainey's children often played. Henderson brought in cattle and soon established a thriving ranch. Blainey, unwilling to leave the matter unsettled, formally squared off his own holdings to include the great oak. There he built an expansive homestead and cut a direct path to the water source. The road leading to his property, running past the church and schoolhouse, was graded and improved, and at his insistence, named in his honor. Then came a grim discovery. Settlers uncovered the remains of a former settlement. 8 dwellings burned to their frames, with human remains scattered among the ash. Christian crosses were found amongst the debris, and Blainey ordered a timber post erected in their memory, marking the site as sacred ground. The cause of the destruction was whispered about, but never formally recorded. The Winona still held land beyond the southern ridge, watching the settlement's expansion with guarded distance. As the town grew, Blainey moved to define its boundaries. He placed posts at the main approaches, noting the distance to Mill Creek and to the larger town of Cedar Bluff, signaling that this was no longer merely a camp, but a settlement with limits. To protect his self-declared town, Blainey organized a watch and petitioned the governor, whose ambitions aligned conveniently with his own, to recognize a formal law officer in the area. For the governor, fast-growing settlements meant tax revenue, rail expansion, and votes in the next election. And Blainey delivered on all three. A county sheriff was assigned jurisdiction, though many of the deputies were men loyal to Blainey. After Henderson's wife was publicly called a harlot and his business described as nothing more than a dirt road empire, Henderson sought to extend his property line to reach Blainey Street, hoping to secure legitimate street access for his ranch. Blainey refused. Henderson appealed to the governor and a mediation was held. Though no open war followed, trust between the two men fractured beyond repair. Their relationship would never recover after one fateful night. Henderson's 3 daughters were killed when their coach overturned on a poorly maintained stretch of road leading into town. The path, long neglected and rutted from heavy wagons, had become treacherous. The route had fallen outside the original survey lines and was never formally graded by the township, despite repeated complaints. Henderson blamed Blainey for failing to maintain the route and held him personally responsible. In grief and fury, Henderson gathered his men and built a roadside shrine at the site of the accident. He remained there for 3 days, keeping vigil. Meanwhile, Blainey quietly strengthened his watch, fearing retaliation should Henderson's mourning turn to violence. Over the following months, Blainey observed that more travelers were arriving, many seeking work on the farms and ranches. A new boarding house was constructed to house the influx, yet Blainey soon judged that not all the men lodging there were of God-fearing variety. In response, a direct road was laid from the boarding house to the church. It became known as Church Street. On Sunday mornings, boarders were strongly encouraged and sometimes firmly escorted up that road to attend church service. Blainey invited the governor to visit, but the governor replied that he would only come if he could arrive by rail. The coach was too unreliable and dangerous. Determined, Blainey sought out investors and negotiated with the railroad company to extend a branch line into the settlement. He even partnered with Davenport to raise the necessary funds and guarantee the spur's profitability. Davenport believed prosperity was safer under Blainey than in open conflict. Henderson was not invited into the arrangement, a slight that deepened the divide between them. Construction crews arrived in the spring, laying ties and track at a pace that transformed the prairie in a matter of months. In time, the railroad reached the town, and the governor stepped off the first train to a great ceremony. Henderson, angered at being excluded, approached the governor to secure land near the rail depot for a warehouse. Quiet negotiations followed, and permissions were granted. Before long, Henderson had erected a warehouse beside the station to store his goods. Blainey responded in kind. He built his own warehouse, as did Davenport, but he did not stop there. Establishing another company under his control, Blainey acquired additional parcels with direct rail access. Henderson soon found his property squeezed, hemmed in by Blainey's expanding holdings to the north and south. Worse still, Blainey's grain enterprise began to dominate the station grounds. 3 silos rose beside the tracks, along with a raised loading platform and a wooden grain elevator. By the time 200 people called the settlement home, the governor pressed for formal incorporation. A name for the town was required. Blainey, unsurprisingly, proposed his own name. Henderson insisted the people decide. In a public vote, the settlers chose the name Robust, a word that had appeared in early rail survey notes describing the fertile prairie soil and robust yields expected from the land. In retaliation for the town people siding with Henderson on the naming, Blainey established a bank, the only one in town. If he could no longer dominate every acre and bit of land, he would control the town's credit and currency. Loans, mortgages, and grain advances now passed through his ledger. In December of 1881, a hard winter settled over the prairie. Henderson grew worried of hauling cattle and goods along the long, snow-choked route to the rail station. In frustration, he ordered a direct track cut across Blainey's property, daring him to object to it. Word spread that the matter would be settled at sundown if necessary. Blainey refused any public confrontation. Instead, he erected a gate along the disputed boundary and posted armed watchmen. When Henderson's men attempted to force passage, shots were fired. 3 men were wounded in the exchange. By the time the sheriff arrived to investigate, both sides laid claim to self-defense, and no charges were filed or laid. As the smoke cleared, Henderson faced Blainey and said only one thing: "This means war." And it all begins in January 1882 with an illegal pistol duel, and the sheriff deliberately sent out of town on this fateful morning. Why a duel? Well, because Henderson, a rancher, illegally carved a track through the holdings of prominent landowner Theodore Silas Blainey, and the dispute erupted in gunfire at the southern gate. Blainey summoned Henderson to a prairie field beyond the town limits, behind the John and Brother Rocks, where the unresolved tension would be settled. The duel was quickly arranged by Davenport, with no word to the sheriff or the governor. Davenport believed that a contained duel was safer than another public exchange of gunfire at the gate. Davenport, whose farm lay on the opposite side of town and largely removed from the boundary quarrels, was eager to see the fractured brotherhood resolved. The terms were simple. First blood would decide it. If Blainey were wounded, Henderson would retain the path. If Henderson fell, the southern gate would close forever. Blainey chose Deputy Tom Lincoln as his second, while Henderson appointed his trusted cattle foreman. The seconds negotiated a distance of 12 paces, inspected the pistols, and agreed that satisfaction, not death, would end this matter. The only surgeon within 50 miles stood by, a man who also kept a modest practice in town. At the signal, despite the agreed restraint, Henderson raised his pistol towards Blainey's head while Blainey aimed for Henderson's chest. They fired. Henderson's ball struck a nearby tree. Blainey's pistol misfired. The powder failed to burn cleanly. Flames spat back at his hand and smoke filled his face. The defective percussion cap spared him a shattered barrel, but not the humiliation. He stood in drifting smoke, wounded by his own weapon and publicly humiliated. Henderson kept the road, and Blainey carried away a quieter vow of revenge. Whispers of the duel drifted through the streets for months. As the years pressed on, Main Street and the surrounding thoroughfares were graded and widened, and the settlement began to take on the ordered geometry of a proper American grid. In time, Henderson secured a formally surveyed and graded road to his ranch, financed from his own purse, proving that public embarrassment was sometimes more powerful than gunfire. Meanwhile, Blainey's wealth and influence deepened as he increasingly turned to financing public works, discovering that infrastructure could achieve what pistols could not. He attempted to extend a northern road beyond town limits, but Henderson's men blocked the works near the memorial to his daughters, and the project stalled half-finished. Redirecting his efforts, Blainey pushed farther north instead, constructing a timber-howled truss bridge over the Cedar River and a 5-mile road linking the town to Robust's cemetery. Not to be outdone, Henderson erected his own bridge west of his ranch, though the governor intervened and prohibited any further western extension, ruling that the adjoining land lay outside Henderson's lawful title. In 1882, the governor declared that Robust required formal structure. For the governor, Robust was no longer a prairie camp, but a tax base tied directly to rail expansion and re-election.
An emergency civic meeting was convened inside the post office to establish a town presidency under the new charter. Blainey, newly credited with upgrading the roads and constructing the Cedar River Bridge, entered the race as the favourite. Henderson ran as well, though he knew the numbers were not yet on his side. Davenport might have prevailed, but his wife had recently lost 2 twin newborn daughters to pneumonia, and grief kept him from the contest. The vote was narrow, but Blainey secured the office. His personal honour may have dimmed after the duel, yet he now possessed institutional authority. Henderson, however, added a new vow: power under pressure. During the governor's visit, Henderson revealed the details of the illegal duel and its terms. The governor quietly summoned Blainey, demanded a $500 settlement to bury the matter, and ordered a boundary adjustment granting Henderson legal rail access. The adjustment was justified as a correction to a disputed survey line filed during initial platting. Henderson had not won the presidency, nor the town's admiration, but he had secured something just as valuable: a lawful slice of Blainey's land. During the mid-1880s, Blainey intensified his grip on the town's development by financing additional infrastructure, effectively owning what ought to have been public amenities. The town lacked a formal treasury, so private financing remained the only mechanism for civic expansion. An engine yard was established near the rail spur, a telegraph office opened to connect Robust to regional markets, and he founded his own newspaper, the People's Bulletin. At his side during these negotiations was his eldest son, Silas Blainey, quiet, observant, and already more interested in contracts and freight rates than in sermons. Despite its title, the publication served more as a platform for Blainey's policies than the public's voice, and each masthead carried a carefully chosen Bible verse. Around the same time, a volunteer fire brigade was organised, modest in equipment, but symbolic of a town edging towards municipal order. The schoolhouse received a second dwelling, not to expand capacity, but to divide it. Blainey had seen the pattern spreading across the prairies: new settlers, new languages, new denominations. Determined to preserve what he called moral order, he sanctioned separate instruction, one school for the baptized, and another, as he bluntly described it, for the damned. Blainey framed the division as a denominational accommodation rather than segregation. In 1884, Henderson's men claimed to have struck gold in the creek, and the town surged into a brief panic of speculation and hope. Within weeks, the discovery was exposed as fool's gold, iron pyrite glinting in the shallows. Henderson, half in defiance and half in humour, rechristened it to Fool's Gold Creek, and the name stuck. Blainey, watching closely, seized the precedent. If Henderson could rename a watercourse and win public acceptance, then so could he. The creek bordering his own holdings was soon entered into local usage, and later survey notes called it Blainey's Creek. With the railroad operating at capacity and requiring continual maintenance, a new wave of labourers moved into Robust, erecting modest rail cottages near the line. The expansion brought what Blainey feared most: immigrants, many of them Lutheran. However unwelcome, the rail wages paid in cash, and cash outweighed resentment. Among them was a reserved Norwegian dairyman, Lars Halvorsen, who established a creamery just behind the edge of Blainey's farm. Halvorsen filed the land claim at the State Territorial Office and granted before Henderson or Blainey could formally object. The move unsettled Blainey. As town president, he could not lawfully grant or revoke disputed land. That authority rested with the governor. Seeking greater control, Blainey began manoeuvring toward a revised town charter and an election for a mayor. To secure votes, he pursued what he understood best: employment. Feedlots were expanded, the station upgraded, and municipal authority was used to subtly adjust property lines in his favour. Henderson recognised the strategy and countered with his own investments, constructing a cattle ramp and aligning financially with Halvorsen. Henderson refused to abandon Robust because every acre he had improved lay tied to rail access he had helped secure. What angered Blainey most was not the competition, but the fact that Henderson was openly employing non-Baptist immigrants and building influence beyond Blainey's moral reach. The 100 or so new immigrants required places to gather, and soon saloons and dance halls lined what became known as Saloon Street. Drunken labourers spilled into the lower street at night, unsettling the order Blainey prized. In response, he ordered the construction of a temperance hall directly on Saloon Street, a moral counterweight planted in the heart of the vice. Davenport, meanwhile, turned towards social reform, financing and operating a poorhouse to manage the town's growing destitution. It was clear to the 4 wealthiest men in Robust that a charter vote loomed, and that infrastructure and public works would shape the electorate. Blainey answered in kind, commissioning a fairground and renaming several streets after the gospel, stitching religion directly into the town's expanding plat. Yet much of this rapid expansion had been built in timber, and disaster followed. A fire ignited one night in Henderson's warehouse and quickly spread, consuming Blainey's adjacent warehouse and several dwellings near the station yard. The volunteer fire brigade, many of whom had been drinking along Saloon Street, failed to respond in time. Flames leapt across the commercial quarter until Blainey and his own men formed bucket lines from the nearby water tank to contain the blaze. By morning, the damage was severe. The firemen were arrested, tried, and hanged at Cheetah's Corner, all within the same day. A hastily assembled tribunal of town trustees declared gross negligence as a capital offence under emergency ordinance. A few protested the speed of justice, but none wished to be seen defending drunken negligence. Blainey declared it swift justice, announcing to the crowd that alcohol and the devil did this. The fire forced a reckoning. Timber construction had proven too vulnerable, and the town began to demand more brick. Yet skilled masons were scarce. Only one trained brickmaker could be found, a German craftsman named Johann Hans Müller. Blainey faced a difficult reality. Nearly 80% of the town's structures belonged to him, and most were timber framed. He summoned Müller, whom he privately referred to as the one good German, and granted him land to establish a brickworks. Surveyors were dispatched to locate suitable clay deposits, and a promising site was identified along the Cedar River. Blainey secured the tract under a 25-year lease, claiming 50% of the profits. With no capital of his own and no competing bidder, Müller had little choice but to accept the terms. Henderson branded the arrangement highway robbery, though he too understood that rapid reconstruction was essential. At the same time, the docks were modernised, and a short-haul river packet began operating 3 times a week along the Cedar, allowing Blainey to move grain and goods downstream with greater efficiency. With the new clay pits in operation and the docks upgraded, the unfinished road linking Robust to the riverfront demanded completion. This time, both Henderson and Blainey signalled a willingness to negotiate. Davenport intervened, offering his men to grade and complete the road, while also proposing that the Daughters Memorial be expanded into a formal park. The surrounding streets were named after Henderson's deceased girls, embedding their memory into the town's plat. Davenport was widely praised for brokering the compromise between the rivals. Davenport preferred stability over ideology, knowing that prosperity required both men alive. The ceasefire, however, proved fragile. Blainey soon authorised the construction of a shooting range and rifle club directly across from the memorial park. What had been a place of quiet remembrance was now punctuated by gunfire, a provocation Henderson could not ignore. Seeking leverage, he turned to the railway workers for support. The Irish arrived next, seasoned railway labourers who quickly established informal dwellings near the tracks without permits or formal subdivision. In retaliation, Blainey decreed that any Irish deceased would be buried outside the limits of the Robust cemetery beyond the town boundary. The cemetery board, stacked with Blainey loyalists, ratified the exclusion. The order was deliberate and political. Overnight, allegiances hardened into voting blocks. Blainey understood exactly what he was doing. He called for a city mayor election under the revised charter, declaring that the winner would hold expanded executive authority. By marginalising the Irish Catholics, he drew many Lutherans towards the Baptist camp, his camp, while the Irish aligned firmly with Henderson. The election result was close, closer than Blainey preferred, but he prevailed. Whatever his severity, Blainey delivered growth, wages, and predictable order in a town that feared instability more than tyranny, and with the mayor job secured, his authority deepened. In 1896, Blainey moved swiftly to consolidate control, allocating additional parcels to his own holding companies and establishing a cattle auction yard that cut directly into Henderson's trade. He also advanced the municipal sewer scheme, though not evenly. The idea was delivered to Blainey by Silas. Blainey still signed the ordinances himself, but increasingly it was Silas, his son, who drafted them. Silas viewed the town not as a congregation, but as a balance sheet, so trunk mains were only laid along Main Street, extending past the schoolhouse, up towards his homestead, and across to the family grain farm. Entire blocks aligned with good Baptist streets received connection, while others were left unserved. Access was justified publicly on the grounds of topography and drainage gradient. The outfall discharged downstream into Fool's Gold Creek, a practical solution on paper, and a political one in practice. Those left unconnected were promised future extensions once funds were allowed, a promise that never quite happened. Henderson's frustration deepened as Blainey's assertiveness expanded. Where Henderson's former warehouse once stood near the station yard, Blainey erected the station hotel, claiming it as compensation for what he publicly alleged had been Henderson's attempt to set ablaze the rail precinct. The accusation nearly triggered another duel. Undeterred, Blainey launched his 14th enterprise, a land bank auction, ensuring that all mortgages flowed directly through his own institution. He subdivided tracts into small town lots and modest farm parcels, offering them at $75 per lot to good Baptists, $85 to Lutherans, and denying sales altogether to the Irish or any man openly aligned with Henderson. In the summer of 1898, as a heat wave settled over the prairie, baseball swept through Robust and a rough diamond was marked out beyond the town limits. But beyond the outfield fences, larger forces were gathering. Enlistment for the Spanish-American War was underway, and every respectable household was expected to offer up a son. Blainey did not send his eldest. Instead, he sent his second eldest, Caleb Blainey, a decision praised publicly as patriotic but quietly understood as calculated. Silas, aged 29, remained at home and was handed full control of the grain and wheat company. Silas was like his father, but colder and less concerned with sermons than with margins. Silas expanded rail sidings, tightened freight contracts, and consolidated warehouse storage under a single company control. By 1900, Silas brought forward what he called a lawful solution. Under the town charter, the mayor could revise the municipal plat boundary before the next census confirmed population totals. With the council stacked in his favour, opposition to this was unlikely. The redrawing of the town's limits would push Henderson's lands beyond the official boundary, cutting them off from municipal services, sewer connection, and fire protection. It was not a duel of pistols, it was a duel of maps. If Henderson's barn or farm burned, Robust Brigade would not respond. Enraged, Henderson gathered 10 men, Irish labourers among them, and a surveyor. They crossed the Fools Creek Bridge and illegally claimed the land beyond the new line, laying the foundation for what would become Robust's first suburb, Henderson. And on a cold winter's eve, Caleb Blainey returned from the war, hardened, unpredictable, and no longer obedient to a father who had sent him away to kill. Silas said nothing, but for the first time in Silas's life, he was no longer certain who would inherit Robust. It was no longer just Henderson versus Blainey, it was now brother against brother. It is 1901, and the sounds of World War I are not far off the horizon. Robust is ruled by this old man, a staunch Baptist with a moustache far too magnificent for someone his age. His name, and don't you dare speak ill of it, is Mr. Theodore Silas Blainey, mayor, landowner, and business mogul. These are his sons, Caleb and Silas, who are expected to inherit the town one day. Yet one man stands in their way, Henderson and his band of Irish railway workers across the creek. And then there is Davenport, the town's reluctant mediator, who spends most of his days trying to stop the two men from killing each other while protecting the people of Robust and the town's future. The feud between Blainey and Henderson has already taken land, money, and blood. But before it is finished, it will take an entire family. Watch the town evolve from 1901 to 1919 through my hand-drawn maps, lightbox, historical photographs, and newspaper clippings. It's 1901 and Caleb Blainey has just returned from the Spanish-American War, angry, bloodthirsty, and wanting a woman. A Henderson girl would do perfectly, forbidden fruit, and the surest way to strike back at his father for sending him to a war he had bitterly protested against. Caleb soon begins secretly seeing 19-year-old Mabel Henderson, a young woman with Irish Catholic blood running thick through her veins and a family name that Blainey would never tolerate. While Blainey's construction company was upgrading the Robust station platform, word reached that Henderson had laid a gravel road across Fool's Gold Creek and through his own property. Henderson's land now sat outside Robust's official town limits after Blainey had redrawn the municipal plat, and along the border Henderson cut a road called Watcher's Lane, posting armed men along it. From there, Henderson's crews, in stages, carved a roughed wagon road westward to Prairie Junction, and soon enough, it was the first time Robust had ever had road access toward the western prairies. Blainey still had spies inside the Henderson camp, and they reported that Henderson and Halverson were quietly building a settlement on private land. This infuriated Blainey. Yet the governor reminded him that property beyond the limits he had drawn now fell outside his authority. It was the first time the governor had openly challenged Blainey. Blainey responded with a warning of a powerful voting bloc at the next election if Henderson was not brought back under control. Henderson installed a checkpoint with armed men and a sign that read, "No Blaineys allowed." And from that moment on, Robust was no longer one town, it was two towns staring at each other across a creek. In response, Blainey named the road leading to the checkpoint Fool's Road. As the feud escalated, more Irish railway workers moved into Henderson, and with a population nearing 150, Henderson petitioned the governor for incorporation. The governor provided a roadmap for the process, and soon a town hall and square were laid out. A set of gallows was also erected. They were more of a warning structure than a court of law, built to scare Blainey men from crossing the creek. Meanwhile, Caleb was growing closer to Henderson and had begun to see Dwight Henderson as more of a father than Theodore. Caleb was even spotted helping construct Henderson's new homestead west of the creek. Mueller, a German mason, grew to hate Blainey's monopoly on construction contracts and quietly sided with Henderson. He worked steadily, firing bricks up and secretly smuggling them into Henderson at night. One evening, Blainey's spies uncovered the operation, and Blainey hurled Mueller before the courts, yet the case was thrown out. Blainey might have been able to buy most of the town, though the magistrate remained out of his reach. The magistrate was a cousin of Davenport, and on the 4th of July 1902, Henderson raised a small timber chapel, and under the starlight, Caleb and Mabel were married. Caleb rode back into Robust the next day and was dragged before the mayor's office, where Blainey beat him within an inch of his life, snarling that if he had to marry a Henderson, why did he choose the ugliest one? From that moment, Caleb was no longer a Blainey in his eyes. Barely conscious, Caleb was sent back on horseback to Henderson. Blainey then ordered his men to string barbed wire around the Henderson settlement, sealing it off from Robust's booming economy, public services, and access to Cedar Bluff. Caleb and Mabel moved into the old Henderson ranch and began restoring it, while Caleb quietly trained the Irish workers in espionage methods that he had learned during the Spanish-American War. It's 1904, and railway expansion across the prairies was moving at a lightning pace. Blainey invested heavily in new sidings and established a coal yard near the impoverished and declining Irish Quarter. The coal was not mined locally, but brought by rail and stored at Blainey's coal yard. Silas proved instrumental in building the Blainey fortune with his sharp business instincts, and another Blainey had now come of age. Samuel Solomon Blainey, 18, intelligent, and deeply conservative, known for being able to shoot a peahen from a mile away, stepped in to fill the void Caleb had left behind. Blainey formalized the family enterprise as Blainey and Sons, and coal shipments soon began moving through the rail yards. He also expanded his cattle empire, squeezing Henderson's operation, which now had to haul cattle 30 miles to Prairie Junction for sale. A new cattle road cut through town and led to Blainey's enlarged cattle yards and auction house. With exports booming, Blainey was pulling in nearly $20 a minute. Silas, now holding greater influence in the family business, had little patience for the town people. He argued to Blainey that the fairground built for public entertainment was wasted land, little more than a circus dump bringing in no profit, and soon the family moved into flour milling and export. With the new industries and raising freight, the railroad and rail yard were now running 24 hours a day, 6 days a week. Yet not everything moved by rail. Silas and the newly elected governor, a hardline Baptist who supported the death penalty for all felonies, pushed for southern expansion and a connection to the growing Prairie Road network. A paved road to Mill Creek was constructed as part of that plan. The Catholics were furious since they had not been consulted and their cemetery stood directly in the path of the expansion. In a tense agreement brokered between Davenport, the governor, Caleb, and Silas, the Irish graves were relocated onto Henderson land. Caleb warned Silas that if the Catholic graves were not returned to their soil, Henderson would burn the town. Silas dismissed the threat. 3 days later, Caleb and 5 Irishmen slipped into Robust and set the volunteer fire station ablaze. No one could prove it. The checkpoint logbooks were mysteriously blank, though Silas knew exactly who was responsible. The priests protested fiercely, though the governor authorized the relocation under state development law. In 1908, electricity finally arrived in Robust when Blainey invested heavily in a coal-fired power plant, installing power lines and ensuring that everything above Luke Street was electrified. Silas pushed the scheme hard, seeing it as a way to strengthen the Blainey empire. As he liked to say, anything south of Luke Street could make do with wax and candles. Yet as the town grew wealthier, the new residents above Luke Street began applying pressure on Town Hall for broader improvements. Soon the rest of the town was connected to a sewer system and a new waste treatment plant, an engineering project that also happened to cripple Halverson's creamery business next door. Halverson protested, though no one in power listened. Caleb answered in his own way. One night, his men cut the sewer pipes along Main Street, sending raw sewage spilling across the newly paved road and onto the street lamps. The mess shut down Main Street for days and became one of the town's worst sanitation scandals. In response, Blainey and Silas rode down to the Irish Railway Quarter and offered any Irish man $500 to cut out Caleb's tongue and bring it to them. None accepted the offer. Meanwhile, Davenport, doing his best to stay afloat and remain outside the feud, began noticing that much of the town's population was struggling. Many residents were disadvantaged, especially small businesses trying to survive while Blainey's monopoly absorbed most of the trade. On land he owned just out of town, Blainey established a farmers market with free stalls, giving local producers and shopkeepers a place to sell without paying Blainey's freight or market fees. By 1910, the city was bursting and the town's infrastructure needed upgrading. The docks were expanded, the water pump system improved, the church added more pews, and Town Hall and the mayor's office received long overdue renovations. A proper jail was also constructed, while the baseball grounds were upgraded and a local team soon formed, the Robust Dodgers. Davenport even attempted to broker a peace match between Henderson and Robust on the baseball field, though Henderson refused the invitation. The governor ordered Blainey to grow the town for the people and decentralize the economy, giving small businesses a fair chance, after many Robust citizens, led by Davenport, petitioned the state for intervention. The governor threatened higher state taxes for Blainey if nothing changed. Blainey responded in his own way, issuing what he called Blainey small business grants through his bank. Soon the town's first independent grocer opened its doors. Caleb and Henderson, eager to strengthen their own settlement and gain favour with the governor, followed suit and opened a grocer of their own, stocking produce hauled in from Prairie Junction. A hardware store appeared soon after, followed by a butcher. But stop right there. The butcher was built right beside the schoolhouse. Why is that? It was perfect. Blainey zoned a commercial lot beside the schoolhouse because the butcher was a friend of Silas's, and a butcher located close to the slaughter and auction yards suited the butchery perfectly. Yet the question remained, what about the children? Some months earlier, an investor had approached Blainey with the idea that Baptist children should be educated away from the progressive state school system. So the investor, William Joe Jr., built a new school in the developing Eastern Estate, well away from the smells of cattle in the slaughter yards. Blainey naturally ensured his name was attached to the school, even though he didn't own it. Entry was strict and the discipline even stricter. Walking south of Luke Street alone could earn a student a paddling. By 1912, the town continued to grow. The first restaurant opened on Main Street, followed by another near the railroad to feed hungry travelers. A doctor moved into town permanently, and soon a small hospital was built across the road. The future of Robust looked bright. The telegraph arrived with a line running along the railroad from Prairie Junction, and the rail network itself was upgraded to handle rising freight. Grain exports were booming, and Blainey opened a futures office to profit from it. Even in his late 60s, Blainey still chased wealth as if every dollar might follow him to heaven. By late 1913, a pharmacy had opened, and the new Eastern Estate finally began selling its first lots. One was purchased by an immigrant from Metz who had come west from the East Coast, his name Heinrich Alder, bringing with him wholesale tractor machinery, mechanical equipment, and plans for a small chicken farm. Along with his wealth came valuable mechanical knowledge, something Silas quickly recognized as an opportunity to exploit. The two men formed a quiet friendship, often meeting away from public view as anti-German sentiment slowly began to grow. Davenport's grandson Thomas spent months working under Heinrich as a mechanical apprentice, and before long, with backing from his grandfather, the young Davenport opened a machine shop of his own. Soon the first Model T Ford car rattled through the streets of Robust. In a clever arrangement, Davenport Sr. and Heinrich introduced a training program that allowed students from the private Baptist school to learn mechanical work at the shop as part of their schooling. Not long after, Davenport established the town's first fuel and gasoline station. Oil, it seemed, might become the path for the Davenports to finally challenge Blainey's hold over Robust. Blainey viewed automobiles as the devil's work and refused to invest in them. When Silas proudly drove home in a new Model T, Blainey set fire to it in the yard. Many townsfolk whispered that the old man had finally lost his grip on modern times. Meanwhile, Caleb focused on raising a family with Mabel and building Henderson's prosperity. For several years, the two towns existed in a tense quiet, held together largely by Davenport's steady presence. That calm ended in 1914 when Davenport died. Without Davenport mediating the feud, the fragile peace collapsed almost overnight. Soon after, Caleb's men rode into Robust and smashed up several businesses along Main Street before disappearing back into the prairie. Nothing came of it. War had just broken out in Europe, and that's where people's interest lay, and the thriving residents of the German district were suddenly very nervous. During the war, a new figure rose in Robust, a Catholic named Arthur T. Bartram, wealthy, charitable, and newly arrived from California. Bartram soon took young Thomas Davenport under his wing. Bartram had made his fortune in the California goldfields, and after discussions with the governor, Blainey, and Thomas's father, the older Davenport, he agreed to invest heavily in the southern side of Robust. The plan was to formalize the old railway cottages into proper housing, partly in response to the Irish Catholics of Robust being treated as second-class citizens despite doing all the hard, gritty work. On one matter, Bartram and Blainey surprisingly agreed, as Catholics were no longer considered the town's chief problem. Lutheran communities were now viewed with suspicion instead. Bartram and Davenport also pledged to reduce crime by redeveloping Robust South. New graded laneways were surveyed and given formal street names. Subsidized housing appeared through the Davenport-Bartram estate. The town's first Catholic elementary school opened, and Bartram built a large residence from which he managed the district's affairs. A small loans office followed, purchasing bad debts from Bainey's Blank held by struggling railroad workers, along with a charity shop. The district soon called Bartram's name, and as the war continued, many of the town's recruits would come from its streets and die in Europe. At the same time, Silas and the governor secured a major transport improvement. The state road network was extended toward Robust, forcing a realignment of Winona Road and promising state funds for a newly graded 2-lane concrete road from Cedar Bluff through Robust to Mill Creek. Silas saw endless possibilities in the new automobile age: hotels, freight traffic, tourism, gas stations, though he quietly knew his father would never embrace it while alive. Even so, old man Blainey still had influence. Re-elected for a 4th term, he ordered Silas and Samuel to focus on wartime infrastructure, a new telegraph office, a telephone exchange, a grain inspection bureau, a war bonds office, and a towering Liberty pole erected at Old Cheetah's Corner to ensure that the governor knew his town was patriotic. On January 17th, the Zimmermann telegraph was sent, a secret message from Germany in 1917 asking Mexico to join World War I against the United States, in return promising help in recovering Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. When the telegram was intercepted and published in American newspapers in March 1917, it enraged the American public and helped push the United States into the war. For Blainey, the news sparked paranoia. If Mexico reclaimed Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, he believed the frontier would creep closer and threaten towns like Robust. War has a way of reaching even the quietest towns, so Blainey launched a fierce campaign to ensure Robust sent as many men to war as possible. The federal government also issued war bond quotas to every town, and Blainey made sure Robust met its targets through his bank. Businesses and households were expected to buy bonds, and the names of those who refused were quietly noted. Notices from the Robust War Recruitment Office declared that all men aged 21 to 30 must enlist. Blainey and Silas, together with the sheriff, went door to door, dragging young men into the office, quietly jailing those who refused. Meanwhile, Caleb, who hated war, quietly opened the checkpoint and allowed any robust citizen unwilling to fight to slip into Henderson and hide. Blainey ordered the construction of a national drill shed and armory and expanded the shooting club into a formal rifle training ground. Soon after, by town decree, Silas ordered that all Germans be rounded up, their stores, churches and beer halls closed. A small tract was carved through the grass to march them away. Davenport stepped forward and offered his own land for the internment shed. The Germans were housed there, and the Davenports did what they could to make their conditions bearable, knowing full well how different it would have been had Blainey ran the camp himself. Then the Spanish flu arrived, and the epidemic tore through Robust. Nearly 10% of the town's population perished, and many more were sent to the quarantine house as doctors struggled to contain the spread. By 1918, the enlistment age expanded to 18 through 45, and Caleb's only son, Patrick, was rounded up by the state and dragged into Robust to enlist. In fact, most of Henderson's men were swept up and sent across the checkpoint into town to enlist. Long lines formed at the train station as men waited to be deployed. Silas secured an exemption from the governor on the grounds of managing essential wartime industries, and he poured money into munition supplies and troop transport through the rail yards. In a rare encounter at the station, Caleb confronted his father and Silas, shouting, "What a bastard you are, profiteering off sending your own young men to war." Blainey simply scoffed, and Silas forced Caleb onto the departing train. Patrick returned to Robust only after a month of service, and he found the Henderson settlement struggling financially. Looking for a way to keep the settlement alive, he established a sawmill, an industry Robust had long since abandoned. While surveying the land near the creek, Patrick discovered something else. Henderson had quietly become a refuge for German families who had slipped out of the internment shed and were now living among the Irish. Many of the Germans changing their name to Irish names. Robust lost 60 men in the first year of the war, and in recognition of their patriotism, Blainey ordered a memorial arch constructed over the newly named Veterans Street. The Robust Cemetery was given a dedicated lawn for war veterans, and the humiliating field where Blainey once fought his failed duel was finally renamed War Veterans Meadow, and nearly every house in town displayed a blue service star in its window. One evening, Patrick Blainey slipped quietly into Robust with his newly married Italian wife, Lucia Romano, and the two noticed something new in the town. A district of large mansions had appeared, built by families who had grown wealthy from wartime contracts. Lucia looked at Patrick and asked, "Do you want this all burned down?" Patrick paused. Lucia continued, "My father has some men in New Jersey. They could come here." Patrick nodded slowly. Progress continued during the final months of the war. Plans were drawn for a new state-funded hospital, the first major civic project without Blainey's name attached. A new town clock was proposed for the square, and work began on a streetcar system with a line planned along Main Street, linking the hospital site with the train station. In early 1919, Caleb returned from the war once again. He stepped off the train and did not head home. Instead, he rode north to the Blainey estate, where Silas, Theodore, Samuel and the rest of the family were gathered around the supper table. Years of war, exile and watching his father profit from sending men to die had pushed Caleb beyond reason. Caleb walked in and opened fire, killing them all. All except one. Beneath the table, an 11-year-old boy had hidden in terror. His name was Josiah Blainey, a quiet child who loved cars, horses and mathematics, and who would carry the memory of that night forever. The sheriff refused to pursue Caleb that night, fearing another war between Robust and Henderson. That night, the old order of Robust died with Theodore Blainey. A power vacuum was now created, with many wanting the town. In the aftermath, the governor, with Thomas Davenport's help, ordered that a Blainey family mausoleum be constructed on a small island carved into the Cedar River. As the Blainey family was laid to rest, a new era had arrived in Robust. Prohibition had come to town, and so did Lucia's family from New Jersey, the mob. If you murder a family of 12, you deserve the chair, right? Well, one violent night in 1919, it ended 40 years of Blainey rule in the town of Robust. Gunfire tore through the Blainey estate, and by morning, the dynasty that built the rail yards, the banks, and most of the town itself lay dead across the dining room floor. The killer was not a rival rancher or an outsider. His name was Caleb Blainey. Unhinged, war-scarred, and furious that the family that sent him to fight in Europe while they counted their profits at home. Every letter from the front, every whispered story of suffering reminded him that the Blaineys valued money over men, including their own kin. When the shooting stopped, only one member of the family was left alive, a frightened boy named Josiah Blainey. Somewhere beyond the estate, a manhunt for Caleb had already begun. This series follows the town of Robust as it grows from a frontier settlement in 1881 into a modern city by 2050. Every street, bridge and factory is drawn by hand using lightbox mapping, historical photographs and newspaper records. The years from 1919 to 1939 would become the most dangerous in the town's history, not only because of crime and corruption, but because power itself was up for grabs. The Blainey dynasty had collapsed, leaving a vacuum that the mob, opportunistic businessmen, and ambitious families all sought to fill. Fortunes were being divided in courtrooms and auction yards, and every new deal, betrayal, or act of violence could tip that balance. The remaining power in Robust was about to be fought over by every ambitious family in town. The morning after the massacre, Robust woke to a silence no church bell could break. For 40 years, the Blaineys had controlled the banks, the rail yards, and the politics of the town. In a single night, that structure collapsed. The man trying to hold what remained together was Sheriff Matthew Colburn, patient, disciplined, and loved the law more than his own mother. He knew that without immediate action, the town could descend into chaos. Feuds would flare, opportunists would seize property, and revenge killings could sweep the streets. He sealed the roads and sent riders across the prairie with one order: find Caleb before the town tore itself apart. In Cedar Bluff, the governor acted just as quickly, sending state investigators to Robust. Many feared the same outcome, that the old feud between the Blaineys and the Hendersons would ignite into open war. While the manhunt spread across the countryside, Robust buried its rulers. In the middle of the Cedar River, where a narrow bend formed a small island, masons built a stone mausoleum for the Blainey family. Barges hauled limestone across the water, while townspeople gathered along the banks to watch the final resting place of the dynasty rise from the river. To make the river safer for regular traffic and prevent flooding, the channel was dredged during the work, allowing the packet boat to run regularly between Robust and Cedar Bluff. The inlet beside the tomb soon gained a name on the survey maps, Theodore Inlet, honouring the town's founder. Even in death, the Blainey legacy continued to shape both the river and the growing infrastructure of Robust. Across from Theodore Inlet, crowds gathered along the riverbank. Some came to mourn, others came to see the place where the Blainey dynasty ended. A rough shrine of flowers, letters and wooden crosses appeared beside the water. Before long, a large boarding house rose nearby, the Blainey Memorial Hotel, built to house the steady stream of reporters, investigators and curious travellers arriving in Robust. For months the verandas of the hotel remained crowded with newspapermen writing about what they now called the Robust Massacre. The story spread far beyond the prairie, and strangers arrived daily hoping to glimpse the town where one family destroyed itself in a single night. Across the river, the cemetery overlooking town drew visitors as well. The grounds were divided into sections: the Baptist plot on the hill, Potter's Field along the fence line, and the new War Veterans Field where soldiers from the Great War were still being buried. The war had ended, though many families in Robust were still mourning sons who never returned. Somewhere among those graves, Caleb hid. Near Potter's Field, a grave had been dug, but the coffin had not yet arrived by rail. For several nights he slept inside that open pit beneath the loose boards and damp soil while deputies searched the countryside around him. Heavy rain the previous week had delayed the burial and kept workers away from any graveyard, leaving most unfinished and undisturbed. The man who had destroyed the most powerful family in town was hiding among the dead, not out of strategy, but because the cold, damp earth reminded him of the trenches in Europe, a place of safety amid chaos. Traumatized and impulsive, Caleb clung to the shadows of the cemetery, acting on instinct rather than reason. 12 days after the massacre, deputies entered the cemetery before sunrise after a farmhand reported fresh footprints among the graves. Caleb tried to run near Potter's Field. A deputy fired, and the bullet tore into Caleb's stomach, dropping him beside another pre-dug grave. Bleeding and half-conscious, Caleb was chained and dragged through the cemetery gates while townspeople gathered along the fence to watch. Caleb survived the gunshot and was later tried for the murders. The court sentenced him to death, and he was sent to Cedar Bluff Penitentiary to await the electric chair in the capital. Inside the prison walls, the man who had destroyed the Blainey dynasty grew darker. Guards described him as feral, unpredictable, and obsessively fixated on only one thought: the boy who had survived the massacre. Caleb obsessed not only over revenge, but also over the inheritance he believed was being unfairly claimed by the child. He spoke often about Josiah Blainey, plotting in his mind how he would one day reclaim what he considered rightfully his. Caleb knew the law, though, would never give him the Blainey fortune, but if Josiah just disappeared, the empire could fall into chaos, and chaos was something that he wanted and knew he could control. In Robust, most people assumed the story had ended, but inside Cedar Bluff Penitentiary, it was far from over. In the weeks after Caleb's capture, the town began moving again. Shops reopened along Main Street, and wagons crossed the bridge again. One decision happened quietly, carefully orchestrated by the court and local authorities. Josiah Blainey, frightened, watchful, and the last surviving heir, was removed from Robust entirely. Court orders placed him under protective guardianship, and he was sent to a boarding school in Cedar Bluff under a different name, ensuring he would remain hidden from anyone connected to the Blainey massacre, including Caleb. Few people in town ever saw him again, and most assumed the Blainey line had vanished. And then the council made a symbolic decision meant to steady the town. The road between the cemetery and town was renamed Blainey Memorial Way, honouring the family that had built much of Robust. Meanwhile, the courts struggled to untangle the Blainey estate. With the mayor dead and the council shaken, the state stepped in to keep the town functioning. A temporary governor's office opened beside the memorial arch while elections were organised. Two candidates quickly emerged: Thomas Davenport, disciplined, civic-minded, and determined to rebuild Robust as a real community rather than a private empire. Opposing him was Harold Whitaker, cautious, polite, and supported by businessmen who feared Davenport's reforms. When the votes were counted, Whitaker narrowly won the mayor's office. The result left Robust with a mayor who favoured stability and business over social reform. The timing was strange though. In 1920, the United States banned alcohol nationwide and Prohibition began. Robust answered with something respectable: a new war memorial plaza beside the arch, complete with a rotunda for speeches and remembrance of the soldiers lost in the Great War. Across town, the public mood appeared disciplined and patriotic, but beneath it, an underground economy was stirring. Locals, eager and inexperienced, were already distilling moonshine. It was cheap, illegal, and often tainted with toxic methanol. Without proper knowledge, the batches were dangerous, and the town's residents risked blindness with every sip. Meanwhile, the old Spanish flu quarantine station was converted into a memorial garden known as the Old Quarantine House. Families visited to remember those lost during the epidemic, and new streets slowly appeared around the grounds as the town expanded east toward the growing city of Cedar Bluff. Survey crews began cutting John Street, a dusty road intended to connect Robust directly to Cedar Bluff. For now, it remained little more than wagon ruts across open prairie. The old war recruitment office soon gained a new tenant: the federal Prohibition agents sent to enforce the alcohol ban. Their job was to hunt illegal distilleries and bootleggers making their own or moving liquor through the rail yards and river docks of Robust. With the Blainey estate tangled in probate, the courts formally placed the holdings under trustees to manage debts, claims, and lingering disputes, ensuring that the fortune could not be seized improperly. Large portions of the empire were sold at public auction: farmland, warehouses, rail contracts, and farm equipment, with all proceeds held secretly in trust for Josiah Blainey until he came of age. The old cattle route north of town became the Blainey Estate auction yard, where bidders from across the state, businessmen, speculators, and men with shadowy reputations competed for each lot. As new owners took possession, surveyors extended streets and plotted parcels, shaping Robust even as the fortune that had built it was gradually dispersed. Across the creek, the Henderson settlement continued to expand. A new bridge spanned the northern bend, linking ranch lands more directly to the road through Prairie Junction and streamlining the movement of cattle and freight. Trouble arrived elsewhere. In the wealthy district known as Thousands Row, several families protested the growing influence of bootleggers. Within months, their houses began burning in the night, one after another. Whispers spread quickly. Lucia Romano, ambitious, calculating, and far more ruthless than anyone suspected, was behind it. Her relatives had arrived quietly from New Jersey, the Romano outfit, bringing money, guns, and connections that ensured she moved freely without challenge. At her side was Patrick Blainey, reckless, charming, and convinced the fortune of his murdered family still belonged to him, despite being Blainey's estranged grandson. As the early 1920s unfolded, the street grid of Robust continued spreading, new homes, workshops, and boarding houses filling the gaps between older roads. The long road west through Henderson and Prairie Junction grew busier each month with freight wagons and the occasional motorcar. On the hill above town, the old Blainey homestead stood still. Court battles eventually ended with the property sold to investors from Cedar Bluff. They soon discovered the massacre had become a huge curiosity. The house reopened as a boarding lodge where visitors could stay and see the dining hall where the Blainey family had been killed, a photo beside the bloodstains on the carpet, a kind of 1920s selfie. The mansion that once ruled Robust now earned money from the story of its own destruction. Prohibition quickly reshaped life in Robust. With the saloons closed, liquor moved underground, and the first speakeasy opened in a downtown basement. While the public adjusted to this new nightlife, a quieter and far more dangerous discussion was taking place behind closed doors. Lucia Romano began studying the Blainey inheritance with her grandfather, the Romano outfit mob boss Alessandro "The Shadow" Ricci. He didn't just take what he wanted, he erased anyone who got in his way. The estate would eventually belong to Josiah unless the boys signed it away. Only one man alive hated the Blaineys enough to enforce that decision. Caleb Blainey was still waiting for a prison transfer to a facility with an electric chair that worked, and Lucia began asking a dangerous question: what would happen if Caleb never reached it? West of the creek, the bootlegging operation grew larger. Men tied to the Romano organization built an illegal distillery along the Henderson riverbanks, hidden among willow trees and old cattle sheds. Crates moved along a narrow dirt trail locals began calling Bootleggers' Way. The distillery soon became more than a liquor operation. It served as a quiet meeting place where Lucia Romano and Patrick Blainey gathered men who did not ask questions. Gunmen arrived from Cedar Bluff and Chicago while plans were discussed late into the night. At the center of those conversations was one name: Caleb Blainey, the condemned prisoner waiting for execution. Lucia believed he could unlock the fortune of the Blainey Empire, and the mob began considering how to bring him back to Robust. Along the rail yard, the freight sidings and warehouses stayed busy even after the Blainey Empire collapsed. Ownership changed quietly. One large depot near the tracks fell under the control of men tied to the Romano organization, storing crates arriving by rail before they were moved toward the Creekside distillery. While the town celebrated prosperity, a violent event unfolded 40 miles away at Cedar Bluff Penitentiary. During a late-night prison transfer, gunmen ambushed a transport wagon outside the prison gates. 2 guards were shot and the prisoner vanished into the darkness. Official reports claim the escapee fled into the countryside. In reality, the mob had come for one man. Caleb Blainey was no longer in prison. Far beyond the edge of town in the scrub hills north of Robust, the Romano crew kept a rough hideout among abandoned sheds and old ranch buildings. Few locals ever went near the place. This was Caleb's new home. Years behind bars had hardened him into something darker, sleepless, violent, and still carrying the rage that destroyed his family. The mob kept guards nearby because Caleb could not be trusted with his own freedom. Some nights gunshots echoed through the hills when his temper broke loose. Lucia Romano visited only occasionally, speaking to him carefully and reminding him of one promise: the day would come when Uzziah Blainey returned to town. The manhunt for Caleb continued for many months, with false sightings reported as far as Chicago, all sightings deliberately made by the Romano outfit, of course. As bootlegging money spread through the town, the old sheriff's office struggled to keep up. Sheriff Matthew Colburn, older now, weary, and watching the town change faster than the law could follow, still tried to hold the line against the growing criminal networks. Robust was no longer the small prairie town he had once policed. The department expanded into a larger municipal police force with a larger holding jail and new deputies, most in the pocket of the Romano outfit. Mayor Harold Whitaker believed stability mattered more than open conflict with the mob, and as long as violence stayed out of the streets, many bootlegging operations were quietly ignored. Across Main Street, the former Blainey Bank building reopened as a state banking control office where regulators attempted to untangle the complicated debts left behind by the Blainey Empire. Education changed as well. The old Baptist private school was reorganized into Davenport Technical College with pro-Davenport loyalties, teaching engine repair and machine work beside the motor garage next door. Across the street, a new Davenport Elementary School opened, one of the first fully funded public schools in town, as Robust continued growing beyond the system that was once controlled by the Blainey family. A new figure began shaping the town's future: Thomas Davenport, methodical, civic-minded, and often called the most attractive young man in town. He began selling portions of his family's eastern farmland and using the money to fund schools, roads, and hospitals. Few people knew Davenport had quietly done something else after the massacre. Through lawyers in Cedar Bluff, he helped arrange guardianship for Uzziah Blainey. Although almost no one knew it, Thomas Davenport had remained in quiet contact with Uzziah through trusted lawyers, receiving only the occasional letter confirming the boy was alive and afar from Robust. This was a secret that Thomas Davenport would take to the grave if need be. Robust was heading towards 50,000 people. Many of the new arrivals were African American labourers seeking steadier work and fewer restrictions than they faced elsewhere. They built a Black Baptist church, followed by a community hall and mutual aid lodge that helped families with food, work connections, and burial funds. Around town, the signs of growth continued. A larger Standard Oil station appeared for the increasing number of cars, and the long-awaited Robust Hospital finally opened its doors thanks to Davenport. The town that once revolved around a single family was now expanding in many directions at once. By the mid-1920s, the rail station district grew busier than ever. The station hotel expanded, a motor coach stop opened beside it, and the buses began bringing passengers from surrounding towns into Robust. Across the city, new infrastructure followed. A municipal water tower rose near the Cedar Creek Bridge, sewer lines for all were laid, and the treatment plant upgraded. Then the mob boss's lawyer quietly arrived, Enzo Incan Romano. He was polished, precise, and carrying a thick monobrow no barber in town dare suggest needed trimming. He opened a law office beside the governor's temporary headquarters. Enzo studied the probate records surrounding the Blainey estate in an attempt to locate where Uzziah was being hidden and by whom. Soon after, a discreet landing appeared along the Cedar River near the cemetery, where boats unloaded contraband liquor at night, and a truck depot began moving the shipments towards Cedar Bluff while the town above pretended that everything was normal. By the mid-1920s, the roaring 20s reached Robust. A new Art Deco hotel rose near the docks, a Ford dealership opened on the main road into town, and an RCA radio tower appeared beside the library where a small station began broadcasting news and music across the valley. Restaurants replaced many of the old saloons, and a downtown jazz club began drawing musicians traveling between Kansas City and Cedar Bluff. South of Luke Street, another business appeared. The Romano organization opened a quiet gambling house along the edge of the Bartram district, drawing gamblers and bootleg money from across the county. Behind the operation stood Lucia Romano, who had quietly taken control of a lot of the mob's business in Robust. Bootlegging, gambling, warehouse shipments, and river landings now moved through networks she organized. Now you need to meet Arthur T. Bartram. He's stubborn, proud, and determined to turn the old Irish railway quarter into something more respectable. Bartram understood exactly what the new gambling house meant. The mob had planted itself directly on the border of his district, and Lucia had no intention of leaving. Bartram wanted the mob gone, but how? At least he wasn't required to pay protection. Yet. This was due to the fact he had an army of Irishmen, unpredictable every day of the week but Sunday. Elsewhere the town kept changing. In the eastern ward built on Davenport land, residents planted community gardens across empty lots, tended largely by the growing African American neighbourhood that had settled there. Unfortunately, many white residents were hesitant of their arrival, but as long as the African American residents didn't step past 3rd Street, they were quietly welcomed. Across the creek, Henderson's Irish community renamed Fool's Road to Irish Road and built St. Mary's Church beside the Irish Cemetery, along with a memorial honouring railway workers from Robust who died in the Great War. Around this time, a theatre man arrived in town. Edward Sound, theatrical, stubborn and convinced the stage mattered more than any mob threat. He opened a theatre near the commercial district. Within months, it burned to the ground after he refused to pay protection money. Sound rebuilt farther south along Mill Creek Road, where Bartram's influence offered some protection. Around the same time, a grand army of the Republic Hall appeared for veterans, an opera room opened above the Italian Social Club, and a new gasoline station rose near the baseball grounds as more motorists began arriving in town. By the late 1920s, the national boom reached Robust. A new commercial block appeared downtown, anchored by a J.C. Penney store, and the baseball grounds outside town expanded with larger bleachers and a scoreboard. Weekend games of the Robust Dodgers drew crowds from across the county, where the mob fixed matches, of course. Prosperity brought trouble with it. Bootlegging and gambling money pushed crime higher, forcing the town to expand the southern jail with even more cells and a reinforced intake block. North of town, leaders opened Robust Field, a small municipal airstrip carved from pastureland for mail planes and transport flights. Some of those flights landed late at night and departed without paperwork, a detail the Romano organization quietly appreciated. Neighborhoods across Robust continued to change. In the African American district along John Street, Davenport raised money to build a new gospel church, and its choirs and revival meetings soon became the center of community life. Downtown, a small stock brokerage office opened with the financial newsroom tracking markets by telegraph and radio as investors chased the booming national economy. Infrastructure kept pace with the city's growth. Engineers widened the Cedar River Bridge so heavier trucks could reach the expanding suburbs. Around the same time, Thomas Davenport received troubling news from contacts in Cedar Bluff. The prison records surrounding Caleb Blainey's escape had quietly disappeared from the state's files. Davenport understood what that meant. Caleb had not simply vanished into the countryside. Someone powerful had taken him. While the town focused on flood plans and the approaching economic crash, Davenport began quietly asking questions about where the most dangerous man connected to Robust might be hiding in town. As the decade ended, some of the town's older industries began shifting. The small sawmill near the creek closed when Patrick Blainey abandoned the business to chase larger schemes. Meanwhile, the empty sawmill land was eventually sold to a Norwegian forester named Sir Thoden Earlsson. Quiet, eccentric, and obsessed with planting trees, rows of ponderosa pines soon replaced the Henderson property while Patrick drifted deeper into the alliances Lucia was building. Not far away, the old Henderson ranch stood still, though the land around it had hard with tight alleys and worker housing. At the center of those streets stood the hall of Sarah Black Sally Henderson. Sharp-tongued, fearless, and trusted by every railway labourer in town, she had turned her home into a gathering place for union men and freight workers who refused to pay protection money to the Romano crews. When the mob collectors began appearing in Henderson, they often left with broken noses and empty pockets worn by Sally's network of loyal workers and the implicit threat of Bartram's support. The district quickly earned a reputation as the one part of Robust where Lucia Romano's influence stopped at the street corner and few dared to cross it. After the floods, the town began taking its rivers more seriously. The channels once known as Fool's Gold Creek and Blainey Creek were combined under a new name, No Fool's Creek, a reminder of how dangerous the water had become. While surveyors updated the maps, Lucia Romano travelled north to the mob hideout where Caleb Blainey had been kept hidden for years, growing crazier and crazier. She brought news he had been waiting to hear. Informants had reported sightings of Josiah Blainey. Caleb listened in silence. The hatred he carried had never faded, and for the first time since the prison break, Lucia knew the weapon she had kept alive was finally ready to be used. But the sightings proved to be false. The informants were actually in the pockets and loyalists to Thomas Blainey. Industry kept moving. In the Davenport district, Heinrich Auder, methodical, mechanical, and stubbornly proud of his German engineering, ran a warehouse supplying tractors and farm equipment to the surrounding countryside, and his business was booming. Nearby, Vaclav Marek, quiet, inventive, and happier surrounded by his tools, expanded his small gunsmith and repair shop beside his homestead. Across town, other changes followed. The robust Orpheum Theatre opened for travelling vaudeville shows, the streetcar line extended down to the river wharf, and the old Mueller clay pits collapsed under debt. The city converted the empty quarry into a dump, and before long, rats and scavengers were running the place. Even as part of the economy weakened, Thousands Row began to rebuild. Investors from Cedar Bluff quietly bought the burnt and abandoned lots and rebuilt the large houses, convinced the rail lines and river traffic would keep robust profitable for decades. Patrick Blainey often walked those streets, imagining the fortune that once belonged to his family. Over time, he noticed something unsettling. The bootlegging routes, the gambling houses, and the river warehouses all answered to Lucia Romano and not him. Patrick believed he was reclaiming the Blainey empire, yet all he was doing was simply helping Lucia build her own. Then the crash came. In 1929, the stock market collapsed and the prosperity of the 20s vanished almost overnight. Grain prices fell, banks tightened credit, and farms across the region began failing. Speculation deals collapsed as well, including several risky ventures tied to Patrick Blainey. Much of his borrowed money disappeared in the crash, leaving Patrick increasingly dependent on Lucia Romano and the criminal networks she controlled, and now he felt even more tied to her than he wanted to be. While Patrick struggled to hold on to what remained of his influence, Thomas Davenport and Arthur Bartram responded to the crisis differently. They combined portions of their farmland into the Davenport and Bartram Farm enterprise, hoping shared equipment and labour could help keep agriculture alive. In Freedman's Quarter, a soup kitchen opened in a church basement, while Black Sally's Hall began feeding unemployed workers lining up with tin bowls and bread. The collapse spread quickly through the town's industries. The coal yard that once fueled the power plant slowed to a trickle, and beside its empty rail spurs, a rough Hooverville appeared. Tar, paper shacks, and scrap wood cabins rising among piles of unused coal. Bread lines stretched from the camp toward the centre of town as officials scrambled to respond, and families who had once worked the rail yards or nearby farms searched for any kind of work. Town Hall reorganised into a relief bureau, handing out food, blankets, and small work assignments. In the rail yard, the old Blainey munitions shed became a warehouse for donated grain and clothing. Businesses continued failing across the region. Johann Mueller's clay quarry closed for good, and Lars Halverson's creamery shut its doors when dairy prices collapsed. The old Blainey cattle yards reopened as a farm auction yard where foreclosed farms, livestock, and machinery were sold to pay debts. In the Bartram district, Arthur Bartram converted his homestead into the Bartram Clinic, offering basic medical care to families who could no longer afford a doctor. And as the Depression deepened, some taverns quietly reopened, their dim lights drawing men who had little left except a drink and the hope that the town might recover. By the mid-1930s, the worst of the Depression began easing as Federal Works Progress Administration programs reached robust. A public works yard soon opened on the edge of town, putting hundreds of unemployed men back to work repairing roads, clearing drainage, and rebuilding neglected buildings. Parks were restored, trees planted, and in the Davenport district, a new municipal swimming pool was built. Its location near Freedman's Quarter quickly stirred arguments about who would be allowed to use the pool. Construction continued with a new post office and a larger, robust elementary school rising on the site of the old schoolhouse. Infrastructure followed. The coal power station expanded and electrical lines finally reached Henderson and nearby farms. Engineers built a levee along the Cedar River and farmers organised a cooperative grain office to stabilise prices. Yet the criminal networks born during the Prohibition were beginning to tear themselves apart. In 1933, a rival gang from Cedar Bluff wanted control of the bootlegging routes running through Robust. The Cedar outfit invited the Romano outfit for a meeting across from the smuggling docks to discuss a truce. The confrontation erupted into a gun battle. 25 Romano men and 16 Cedar crew were killed. Locals later called the violence the Robust Massacre of 1933, a brutal fight that shattered much of the mob's influence in the region. The Cedar Bluff outfit put a $5,000 bounty on Lucia's head. Lucia and Patrick collected Caleb and fled to Chicago with a vow to locate Josiah at any cost. By the middle of the 1930s, signs of recovery began appearing across Robust. Along No Fools Creek, the Henderson family opened a soap and tallow factory that turned livestock byproducts into candles and industrial soap for markets across the region. The operation grew quickly, employing dozens of workers who had lost jobs during the Depression. Many came from the surrounding neighbourhood that locals now called Black Sally's District, while Thomas Davenport focused on helping Mayor Whitaker rebuild schools and public infrastructure. Downtown slowly revived. Businesses reopened around the old Blainey flour mill, and new dentists, accountants and medical offices appeared along Main Street. The town was rebuilding again, piece by piece, even while many families still carried the scars of the Depression. By the late 1930s, the fragile calm began shifting again. The military recruitment office reopened in town, and a small civil defense office appeared beside it as tensions overseas grew. A few streets away from Main Street, National Guard training grounds were laid out, where young men drilled with rifles and trucks on dusty fields. Whispers that the world was destined for another great war were stirred. Meanwhile, Freedman's Quarter continued expanding. New streets filled the neighbourhood, and residents built a basketball court beside the churchyard where local teams gathered on weekends. A gospel radio hall opened to broadcast sermons and choir music across the valley, and activists established a civil rights meeting hall nearby. The city's parks increasingly became the places for both celebrations and public speeches as Robust continued working through its social divisions. Across town, industry and culture pushed forward together. Vaclav Marek expanded his small gunsmith shop into a larger mechanical yard, adding a motor repair garage that grew farmers and truck drivers from across the county. In the Henderson district, Black Sally's Labour Hall grew into a busy centre with music rooms and union meetings, eventually becoming the headquarters of a regional Labour council. In town, a bowling alley, cigar shop and cabaret appeared as nightlife returned again. Nearby, Bartram opened a workwear factory producing durable clothing for railway crews, farmers and factory workers across the region. Urban growth followed the recovery. Surveyors pushed Mill Creek Road outward and mapped new housing tracts as Robust struggled with a growing housing shortage. In 1939, the city built its first skyscraper, a 12-story tower on Main Street backed by Davenport banking interests, housing insurance firms, brokers, and the agricultural cooperative that had helped stabilize local farming. Transportation improved at the same time. The streetcar line reached the Bartram district, John Street was finally paved towards Cedar Bluff, and a new Davenport station opened south of the old quarantine grounds along the Mill Creek rail line. Around it grew a roadside hotel, gasoline station, and a small strip of shops, as also the highway through town was rebuilt in concrete. As the town pushed outward, older districts changed again. Black Sally's district expanded north to meet the bridge across No Fools Creek, and Henderson's old square was upgraded with new shops selling cheaper goods than in Robust Town. A Knights of Columbus Hall appeared, and near Marek's workshop, a rough road junction became known as Five Ways when 5 cars collided in a fiery automobile crash that left Halverson dead. In Thousands Row, rebuilt houses gained proper street names and property values climbed again. The railway station added a new troop deployment platform, a quiet sign that another war might be coming. On land shared by the Davenport and Bartram families, the old internment camp was repaired and placed on standby for Germans. But it wouldn't be Germans housed there. In the years to come, it would be someone else. Robust was growing again, preparing for the future. But one piece of its past had returned. Somewhere beyond town, in abandoned buildings once used by bootleggers and mob gunmen, Josiah Blainey had quietly come back. For years before returning, Josiah had watched Robust from afar, reading its newspapers, studying its maps, and learning the names of the men who now ruled the town his family once controlled. The frightened boy who survived the massacre was now a grown man, older, well-travelled, wealthy beyond extreme, and carrying a memory that had never faded. Josiah wanted revenge. He wanted Caleb dead, and he wanted what was rightfully his, Robust. This map tells a lie, because it doesn't show the scale of blood and chaos spilled across this county. Through hand-drawn maps and historical photographs, you'll start to see why this part of the Midwest was always in the trenches. By the 1940s, Cedar County looked stable, clean grids, a state park, a growing centre at Cedar Bluff, and transport lines tying everything together. But every road, every rail line, every stretch of farmland was negotiated, fought over, or quietly traded behind closed doors. Because for years, the land, the rail, and the money all ran through one man, Theodore Silas Blainey. Many of his critics called the former mayor ruthless, cold-blooded, and sanctimonious. When his dynasty was murdered out of existence, control spread into new hands. The governor knew this. He hated Robust like a splinter buried in too deep to pull out. The governor has been watching this county closely ever since the Dynasty Massacre and everything that followed. The mob deals, the land auctions, the infrastructure grabs, and now, in Cedar County, he's no longer dealing with one man trying to control a town. He's dealing with multiple factions trying to control an entire region. And right now, in 1940, something is about to shift again, through a highway that hasn't been built yet, a rail connection that shouldn't exist, and a river that quietly controls more power than anyone wants to admit. A river that decides which way you're allowed to go. Before anything was built here, the Cedar River decided where people could live. The Winona people already understood that. These curves on the map aren't random. They mark where movement is possible, where boats can slow, and where early settlers could survive long enough to stay. Cedar Bluff forms where the river and land makes it viable. The bluffs keep it above flooding, and the nearby timber gives it purpose. Lumber first, then docks, then rail once goods need to move faster. South of that, the river tightens and limits scale, so development stays smaller. To the west, the land remains largely untouched, not because of protection, but because it didn't offer the same immediate return as timber, transport, and industry along the northern bank. By the time these tracks are being pushed through Cedar County, rail is all about control. The original line into Robust was built to serve Blainey's empire, feeding grain, cattle, and freight directly into his yards. That alignment still matters. It locks Robust into the network as a processing town, not just a settlement. But now, new extensions began reaching outward, toward Prairie Junction in the west and down toward Mill Creek, and every one of those directions represents a different group trying to pull influence away from what used to be a single power base. The governor is watching these alignments closely because until the automobile dominates this landscape, rail determines who grows and who gets left behind. A line toward Prairie Junction opens inland trade and weakens dependence on the river routes. A southern extension towards Mill Creek ties into the state road planning and future highway corridors. And the vertical connection near Cedar Bluff is the most important of it all. It goes to Chicago. And it also links timber, the river docks, and the expanding urban center into one controlled system. And by 2050, all these towns will merge into a single urban mass. But for now, these lines follow negotiations, approvals, and at times quiet pressure across private land, shaped by whoever holds leverage in the moment. The penitentiary sits just outside Cedar Bluff, positioned to maintain control while remaining removed from the city's daily life. Caleb Blainey, the man who murdered the Blainey family, was sent there, but then he escaped. The The county snapped into panic. Elites slept with one eye open. Schoolboys chanted on the playground.
Caleb's gone. Caleb's free. He's coming back for you and me.
Deputies flooded the roads. Every movement watched. After the dynasty collapsed, the state stepped in. And from that point, the roads began to take shape around it. These purple alignments are not just casual connections. They link the prison to Cedar Bluff, to Robust, and out toward Prairie Junction and Mill Creek, ensuring movement of officials, goods, and enforcement can happen without relying entirely on rail or river. The road network spreads where the state needs reach, tying together timber, farms, and settlements into something governable, and every mile of it reflects a quiet shift. Control is no longer concentrated in one place. It's being distributed across the entire county. The Winona Reserve sits where expansion slowed and profit thinned, held in place more by economics than protection. The governor allowed it to remain because the land to the west offered little return compared to the timber and transport corridors to the east and south, and pushing further would cost more than it gained. That old track running past it comes from an earlier time, first used by the Winona and then by settlers moving between crossings, long before rail or formal roads took control over the county. Robust exists because three men forced it into existence: Blainey, Henderson, and Davenport, each pulling the town in a different direction from the very beginning. What started as a crossing point along the river became a power struggle built on land access, rail control, and who got the profit from it all. Blainey built to control, Henderson built to challenge, and Davenport built to hold things together long enough for the place to function. The governor has never trusted this town, not after the illegal Blainey-Henderson duel, the boundary disputes, and everything that followed. A place where infrastructure was used as leverage and not city planning. And even now, Robust sits at the center of the county because of that early positioning, where rail meets river, where roads converge, and where influence has always been contested. Prairie Junction exists for one reason: movement across open land that the river and Robust can't fully serve. It becomes the western outlet, handling cattle, grain, and overland freight coming in from the prairies before anything ever touches the rail yards or river docks of Robust. Its relationship with Robust has always been uneasy. Robust wants control over what passes through, just like Blainey once controlled access to his land, while Prairie Junction depends on staying just independent enough to avoid being absorbed into that system. The governor tolerates it because it relieves pressure on Robust's network, though he knows if one side ever gains full control, the balance across the county shifts with it. Cedar Bluff predates everything else here, founded around 1804 as a river timber settlement, long before Robust existed, and before anything turned against them. Blainey, Davenport, and Henderson were once friends. They passed through here together, using its docks, supplies, and early roads as their gateway into the prairie south. Over time, what began as a rough river town evolved into the state capital, and with that came the governor's residence, administrative officers, and a class of elites who positioned themselves close to power: bankers, industrialists, and officials shaping decisions that affect the entire county. The surrounding farms feed the city, the nearby industry processes what the rail and river bring in, and everything is tied together under state oversight, making Cedar Bluff the one place in the region where control feels structured, even if the rest of the county resists it. Between 1900 and 1940, Cedar Bluff expanded rapidly as industry lines, the riverbanks, rail yards intensified, and surrounding farmland expanded to supply a growing urban population. As the state capital, this growth concentrates authority around the governor, whose office now sits at the center of decision-making for infrastructure law and regional stability. That authority was pushed hard in 1919 when the Blainey Massacre tore through Robust and left a power vacuum that threatened to spill outward across the county and his city. State investigators moved through Cedar Bluff, orders were issued from the governor's office, and control over transport, land, and policing began tightening, shaping how the entire region developed in the years that followed. St. Augustine's Academy sits just outside the main flow of the city for a reason. Close enough for oversight, but far enough to keep its students removed from the noise of Cedar Bluff. This is where Josiah Blainey was sent at just 11 years old. quietly removed from Robust after the massacre that wiped out his family. The state placed him here under a different name, James Ricketts of Chicago, under watch and educated among the sons of elites and officials, while outside those walls, the empire his family built was being divided, sold, and fought over. Cedar Bluff's population surged because pressure across the region funneled people towards it. After the Blainey Empire collapsed, land in and around Robust is divided, sold, and contested, pushing workers and families out toward a place where authority and structure are still intact. Through the 1930s, economic strain, tightening state control, and the after effects of crime and instability across the county all concentrated activity into the capital. Rail yards expanded, river freight increased, factories took on more labour, and surrounding farms scaled up to meet demand, drawing a steady flow of people into Cedar Bluff as it continued to grow. Robust continues expanding outward along the lines that were set decades earlier, especially around Henderson's side of the creek and south of Luke Street, where working communities and industry had already taken hold. The rail access nearby yards and established labour base kept drawing development into these areas, filling in gaps with tighter housing and small industry and local services. Further south, Mill Creek grew from a scattered settlement into a proper town as road and rail links improved, supported by nearby farms, resource access, and its position along the southern routes, giving it a defined role within the wider county network. Robust finally secures funding for a central park after Mayor Whitaker pushes the issue through the state offices in Cedar Bluff, arguing the town needs civic space as much as industry. The park is placed at the heart of the grid, giving residents a shared ground in a town long shaped by conflict, rail, and hard expansion. Robust population pushes toward 50,000 as pressure builds elsewhere, especially in Cedar Bluff, where rising land values and industrial expansion begin pricing out workers and young families. As factories grow and elites consolidate land near the capital, many are forced to look outward, and Robust offers something Cedar Bluff no longer can: space and savings. Large tracts are opened and sold. Post-war housing subdivisions begin appearing on the edges of town, and with rail, road, and river connections already in place, people arrive steadily, turning what was once a contested settlement into a rapidly expanding urban centre. Cedar Bluff continues expanding rapidly too as its population climbs towards 170,000 people, pulling in migrants, workers, and families from across the region and beyond. Districts like Little Italy emerge as tight-knit communities form around shared culture and employment, while new industry spreads along the river and rail corridors to support the growing workforce. The city becomes denser, more complex, and more influential, with every new arrival feeding the industries, services, and political weight concentrated around the state capital. The Ashford family, now the wealthiest in Cedar Bluff, privately funded a botanical gardens and zoo, shaping a refined public space that reflected the influence over the city. At 18, Josiah Blainey began courting their daughter, and the two are often seen walking through the gardens on quiet afternoons, though Mr. Ashford kept a careful eye on him, sensing something didn't quite add up, even though he could not exactly explain why. The Prairie Highway receives the designation State Route 6, marking it as a priority corridor for the state and placing it under direct oversight. With that designation came a realignment to straighten the route and improve travel conditions, cutting across existing farmland and long-held property lines. Land is acquired through state-backed purchase powers common at the time, and while many farmers accepted payment, others resisted, slowing sections of the project and forcing drawn-out negotiations before the route could be fully completed and connecting the county. Cedar Bluff State Park officially opened in the spring of 1936, set aside by the state to protect the river bends, forested bluffs, and scenic lands just outside the capital. The governor backs the project as part of wider public work efforts during the Depression, putting men to work while securing the landscape from private development and quarry expansion nearby. With controlled access roads, designated slow speed areas, and marked entry points, the park quickly becomes both a recreational space for residents and a statement of state presence, preserving land that might otherwise have been absorbed into the city's rapid growth. June 1948, a private recording leaves Cedar Bluff, addressed directly to President Harry S. Truman. The governor speaks plainly. He describes a county held together by infrastructure more than trust, a capital swelling with industry and influence, a highway system forcing order across farmland, and a river that still dictates where power settles. And then he turns to Robust, a town founded through rivalry, built on deals, and shaped by men who treated land, rail, and people as leverage. He recounts the Blainey years, the massacre, the years of instability that followed, and the constant need for state intervention just to keep the place functioning. Even now, with 50,000 souls and expanding suburbs, the same patterns remain. Influence contested, growth uneven, decisions pushed through pressure rather than city planning. He closes with a warning to the president: Cedar Bluff can be governed, the county can be managed, but robust is something the state has never fully controlled. In the months that follow, that warning turns into action. Using the expanded emergency powers and pressure through the state legislature, the governor suspends Robust's municipal charter and installs a state-backed administrator, the daughter of the wealthiest man in Cedar Bluff, Virginia Ashford, and Charlotte's mother. Her appointment is framed as temporary stabilization, though everyone understands exactly where the influence is coming from. Few outside elite circles connect her to the quiet young man she has been courting, and Josiah's identity remains buried beneath layers of distance and silence. In Robust, the reaction is immediate. A working-class rail and industrial city now finds itself under the direction of a posh, well-connected woman from the capital, placed there without a vote. Yard workers, labour families, and long-time residents see it as an interference from Cedar Bluff, another decision made over their heads by people who have never lived their conditions. The tension that built this town in the first place begins to surface again, now aimed squarely at the state. Weeks after the governor's recording reaches Washington and the president, movement begins quietly. Federal agents arrive in Cedar Bluff without announcement. No press, no public statement. They move through the rail yards, the hotels, the boarding houses, asking questions that no one in the county wants to answer. Whispers have reached them. Caleb Blainey is alive. His wife, Lucia, is with him. And somewhere in Cedar County, Caleb and Lucia are raising a young child. The reports all point to the same thing. Informants claiming Josiah Blainey has also returned. And if that is true, then the last two pieces of the Blainey story are now in the same place, Robust, watching, waiting, and this time, the state is not the only one trying to find them.
Cars, war, revenge. But for now, it is 1941 and the city is under pressure. The Selective Training and Service Act begins pulling young men away from towns like Robust, and after Pearl Harbor, the draft expands without hesitation. Streets begin to empty, rail sidings begin to fill, and the entire industrial structure of the town is redirected towards war production. Robust Grill feeds workers on ration goods, even opening a second venue near the troop deployment station. The war rationing office appears along the main corridor, and the rail yard pushes freight day and night towards Cedar Bluff and beyond the newly funded line to Chicago. Into this moment steps Chris Marks, ambitious, calculated, and obsessed with filling gaps left by other men's failures, arriving with an already profitable East Coast company, Marks Industries, and a clear understanding of what Robust lacks: control. He sees a vacuum left behind by the Blainey collapse, a system that was never properly replaced, and he builds directly into it. He chose Robust for its rail junction, airfield access, and distance from major oversight, a place where contracts could be fulfilled without interference. The airfield district expands near the rail and airfield, factories producing engines, radios, and military components under his federal contracts, tied into national production lines feeding aircraft planes back east. Temporary worker housing spreads across the site, population returns in a different form, and the town begins to grow under wartime demand, structured around logistics, output, and efficiency. The freight lines become the lifeline of the town, running north and creating new railroad crossings, the first for the city. The city is a huge exporter of engines, radios, and crated parts out of the factories, while fewer goods are coming back into Robust. Cedar Bluff remains tied to administration and rail management, lacking the industrial land needed to scale at the same speed, and this puts Robust ahead of its rival neighbour. Rationing begins to press into daily life, from sugar, fuel, rubber, all controlled through the War Rationing Office, and even the businesses along Main Street begin to feel the strain as shelves thin and deliveries slow. Young men continue to leave in waves, some drafted, some volunteering, their absence visible in empty homes and quiet streets, replaced by shift workers and temporary labour drawn in by Mark's contracts. At the same time, the Prairie Highway begins to take shape and formalise as a state route, linking Mill Creek through into Robust and onward to Cedar Bluff, carrying military vehicles, supply trucks, and long convoys that reshape how movement is understood in the region. Robust is becoming a pivotal stop on the way to Chicago. At 5 ways where multiple routes converge and car accidents are a weekly occurrence, nearing the growing edge of the city, planners and engineers begin to take interest, marking it as a future control point in the network, a place where traffic, freight, and people can be directed, measured, and managed as the town continues to reorganize itself around the demands of war. War pressure begins to harden the edges of Robust, and the city starts to fill with infrastructure built for survival and output. Industrial intensification takes hold across the airfield district as existing buildings are converted to full war use, while fuel storage tanks rise beside the rail lines and river to sustain constant movement of goods. A truck depot expands along the southern yards, coordinating freight between road and rail, and temporary worker housing fills in dense blocks nearby, packed with families and labourers brought in to meet the demand. On the outskirts, munition bunkers are placed quietly into the landscape, hidden storage tied to army logistics, feeding into the same network that runs north through Cedar Bluff. In the city core, the hospital wing is extended under emergency planning conditions, with a Red Cross building established across the road to manage the flow of injured workers and returning servicemen, while a recruitment office increases intake as the draft continues. And across the streets, blackout sirens and air raid shelters begin to appear, embedding civil defense directly into the urban fabric, frightening adults that the Germans might appear. The internment is also reopened, and local Japanese and German families are rounded up, the Davenport family once again finding themselves caring for the supposed enemy. By 1945, the war ends, and the city is forced to reset almost immediately, though the pressure never really leaves. Names are added to the war memorial, rows of them, men who never returned, while those who did come back find a city that has been reorganized in their absence. Small clusters of veterans housing appear north of the city, placed with state backing, and Robust Grill expands under Mr. Mason to feed a new kind of workforce, one made up of returning soldiers and industrial laborers who never left. At the same time, power consolidates. Miss Virginia Ashford, composed, strategic, and deeply interested in placing the right people in the right position before anyone notices, is installed as mayor with emergency powers from the president and governor, stepping into a role where the governor gave her only one objective: stop Robust from being a state embarrassment. Under her administration, the police headquarters is upgraded into a centralized force, the southern jail expands its capacity, and utility expansion pushes water and sewer systems outward to meet new demand. A power substation comes online, the water towers are upgraded, and a radio tower begins broadcasting across the region. Thomas Drive is laid as the start of a new planned suburb, named after Davenport, marking his continual influence over movement and planning, while Henderson starts a trucking company, and the Blainey name remains absent in public, though not forgotten, as the structure of the city becomes more ordered, more connected, and far more controlled than ever before. The mayor is pleased that stability has returned. Around this same time, another return begins, though far quieter. Josiah Blainey, patient, watching, and unable to forget what he saw at age 11 when the Blainey name collapsed into blood and silence, re-enters the world under a different identity, James Ricketts of Chicago. Through this name, he meets Charlotte Ashford, a prominent Cedar Bluff socialite, their connection formed within circles that placed him near the most powerful family in the state. Their marriage is built on what is presented, not what is hidden. When Virginia Ashford begins reshaping Robust, Charlotte pushes for a move to Robust, her, Josiah, and their young child wanting to be closer to their grandmother. Josiah's hand is forced, and he chooses to listen more than he speaks, studying how the city now functions, who holds influence, how decisions are rooted, and where control can still be taken. They move into an old property in the northwest of Robust, restoring it without attention, settling into a position that feels quiet from the outside. To the public, he remains James Ricketts, a man comfortably under the thumb of his hot wife. His standing explained through her name, though that same connection places him close to power and far closer than anyone would accept if they actually knew who had actually returned. By the late 1940s, the pressure shifts again, this time into growth. The baby boom begins to physically reshape the map, and the city responds by building into it. William Junior High expands from a technical school into a full campus under Davenport influence, tied together with school walkways that allow controlled movement between buildings, while a central school library and cafeteria becomes the anchor of the school. Elementary schools stretch outward into new neighborhood blocks, a childcare center appears for the first time, and the hospital pushes further with a maternity ward, babies popping out like a production line. Small community parks are inserted between streets, placed deliberately to stabilize residential growth and keep families local. The city's most famous names all have babies too. William Davenport, son of Thomas, Daniel Halverson Henderson, son of Black Sally, Alfred Bartram, and Edward Blainey, son of the downtrodden man Patrick. The city begins to sound different. School bells, prams, rock and roll, and a generation all arriving at once, filling the spaces that war left behind. At the same time, whispers begin to move through the town, quiet at first, then repeated more often than they should be. Josiah Blainey, still known publicly as James Ricketts, settles further into Robust with Charlotte, their presence becoming harder to ignore. Some remember fragments, a boy who disappeared, a family that collapsed, a name that never fully left. And a few begin to ask questions they do not say aloud. During their extended travels earlier in the decade, a child had been born far from Robust, his name Theodore Blainey, his arrival tied to Australia and a life that does not quite fit the story people believe. When that name begins to surface in town records and conversation, it creates a quiet tension, enough for older residents to look twice, enough for others to start connecting threads that were meant to stay buried. The system continues to grow, school filings, streets extending, families settling, though beneath it, recognition begins to form, and not everyone is comfortable with what they think they are starting to see. Has the vast wealth of the Blainey dynasty returned? And if so, oh shit, they thought. By the early 1950s, the city began to reorganize itself more around the automobile, and the shift was immediate. Main Street starts to change function, no longer just a place of trade, now a corridor of movement and access. Mark's appliance store appears, selling the new machines of the modern home, while Roebuck and Company and Montgomery Ward establish themselves as anchors of consumer demand, pulling people into town with catalogs turned physical. Along the roadside, the A&W drive-in movie theater introduces a new pattern of behavior. Texaco stations begin to appear at key junctions tied directly into the growing traffic flow. Further out, the first Holiday Inn is proposed along the highway corridor, signaling that movement through the town matters just as much as movement within it. Then comes the traffic lights, installed at key intersections. First one, then many. The time controls controlling flow for the first time, stopping vehicles in place, but also confusing drivers and drawing crowds who stand and watch the lights change, unsure when to move and how they actually work. The system becomes regulated, measured, enforced, and the street begins to belong to the vehicle. They represent the first time movement in the city is no longer negotiated by people, but dictated by a system, and car dealership sales boom. Inside this shift, young Theodore Blainey grows up surrounded by motion, engines, noise, routes, watching cars move through the Prairie Highway and cars queue along the new service roads, developing a car fixation that does not go unnoticed. Josiah Blainey begins to follow that interest, first locally, then further, making quiet trips east towards New York to meet Robert Moses. who's connected, influential, and more interested in highway interchanges than women. Back in Robust, Charlotte Ashford speaks frequently with her mother, the mayor, with discussions centered on expansion, positioning, and scale, a shared understanding that Robust can overtake Cedar Bluff if it controls movement at the right points. Plans begin to form around land, zoning, and access, conversations that never reach the public, while a cultural shift takes hold across the town, a steady removal of the old frontier identity, fewer horses, fewer open lots, fewer traces of the past, replaced by paved surfaces, structured streets, and a city that is beginning to present itself as modern, ordered, and built for what comes next. But sadly, as the car is here, the streetcars close, and the Davenport rail station has its last service to Mill Creek. Then, without warning, the past returns in full. Caleb Blainey, hardened, unstable, and carrying years of violence that never settled, comes back into Robust with Lucia Romano, the wife he stole off his own son and had a child with, named Anthony Tony Blainey, watchful, violent, and a certified Mensa genius. Their arrival does not stay quiet, not this time. Word spreads quickly, the Blainey name spoken openly again, and with it comes attention from outside the city. The feds begin to take interest, already in contact with the governor, already aware that something in Robust is moving again, and they set up an office downtown. Deals are made in rooms no one else sees, understandings reached between state power, federal oversight, and those who still operate in the shadows. Caleb finds himself pushed out of the system he once dominated, denied access, denied support, denied even legacy, and when he dies, there is no place for him in the Blainey plot. No stone, no name, only Potter's Field will do him, placed among the unclaimed graves, as if the city itself has decided to erase him. Rumours of who pulled the trigger that killed Caleb Blainey spread faster than facts, though no official account is ever given. But who actually killed Caleb Blainey? Let's go back a bit. An FBI superior, aware that James Ricketts is Josiah, lets leak to people that know Caleb about Josiah's whereabouts and that he is back and rebuilding the old mob hideout. Caleb finds out and gets his Tommy gun and hands a gun to Lucia and Tony. Under darkness, they trek into town and into Josiah's newly built homestead. But little does Josiah or Caleb know that the FBI have had the homestead under surveillance for weeks. Inside the homestead is Josiah and young Theodore, with Charla away in Cedar. Every player is now in place, every outcome already decided. Caleb, Tony, and Lucia enter through a deliberately open back door, but are quickly rounded up by the feds. The feds drag everybody into the living room and say to Josiah, "Do it, take them out and we won't look." Young Tony watches as it unfolds, as his parents, Caleb and Lucia, are shot in the head, bang, without mercy, in the same way history once repeated itself for another boy. Josiah Blainey stands in that room, patient, exacting, and fully aware of what this moment represents, his name no longer hidden, his return understood by all who matter. His son has seen him kill, and leaving Tony alive so he could remember everything, just like he had to, the final nail in the coffin. The room falls quiet, and the feds just leave the whole town in fact. Caleb had been a liability tied to multiple jurisdictions and embarrassed the governor by escaping a state penitentiary, and removing him quietly avoided a wider investigation that would expose everyone involved. Letting Josiah do the killings kept officials' hands clean, leaving the outcome to those already inside the conflict, and Josiah a potential fallout guy if the feds ever needed to control the Blainey family name again, something Josiah overlooked in the heat of this revenge. Tony flees and Josiah sits with Theodore and threatens him to never tell his mother. The truth does not stay contained after that night. It moves through the town in fragments. Then in certainty, James Ricketts becomes Josiah Blainey in full, spoken openly in shops, in offices, across Main Street and out toward Five Ways, until there is no separation left between the name he used and the name he carries. That forces a conversation that cannot be delayed. Inside the Ashford residence, away from the public eye, Josiah speaks plainly to Charlotte and Virginia. The story laid out without disguise, what he saw as a boy, why he left, why he returned under another name, and what he intends to do now that the system is within reach. There is no apology in the way he explains it. Virginia listens, measuring every word against the city she had already begun to shape, against the expansions, the control points, and the highways being planned. Charlotte watches the same thing from another angle, the scale of what Josiah is proposing, the speed at which he is willing to move. The lie matters for a moment, then it becomes secondary to what he offers. Josiah brings a framework for how the city will be controlled and how the Ashford and the Blainey name combined is stronger together than fighting against it. He speaks in routes, in interchanges, in fuel access, in how land along corridors becomes leverage, how traffic can be directed before it even exists, how a city can position itself ahead of a system and force that system to pass through it. Virginia sees it immediately as expansion and control beyond Robust, beyond Cedar Bluff, reaching into state influence through infrastructure and control. Two names that had operated separately begin to align: Ashford and Blainey. Civic authority and inherited power, planning and execution, join with a shared understanding of scale. Quiet decisions begin to form around land acquisition, zoning adjustments, service placements, all tied to routes that have not yet been built, though already mapped out in private. The town feels the shift without fully understanding it, a tightening of control at key points, a sense that movement itself is being claimed. Robust begins to move with intent, and for the first time, that intent is coordinated at the highest level, and two of the richest families in the state are involved. Then the town breaks open. The grid stretches outward into land that had never been formalized, and the southern and northern subdivisions become the first truly planned suburbs, laid out with intent rather than reaction. Streets carved into cul-de-sacs that interrupt the old grid and slow movement into controlled loops. Rows of starter homes appear in repetition, same setbacks, same footprints, even with driveways and garages built directly into the lot, binding daily life to the automobile before residents even arrive. To the west, the Henderson suburb expands into a full grid build-out, named streets, service parcels, and at its center, a new kind of retail anchor forms as Henderson Super opens its first large format store, replacing scattered grocers with a single point of supply. The Henderson lineage extends beyond trade into trucking and logistics, fleets moving along the Prairie Highway and into the new suburbs, controlling how goods enter and circulate through this expanding system. At the same time, power shifts into alignment with the road itself. The Davenport line pushes into social reform, expanding subsidized daycare centers. Across the same town, Josiah Blainey begins to act on the framework he described, and Theodore Blainey grows into it, scared of his father, the two moving in step with the rise of the car, influencing decisions that reshape land use at scale. Parks begin to be reassessed for conversion, surface lots appear where green space once held ground, and Blainey Parking Company emerges across the core, laying out marked bays, installing street meters, and tying revenue directly to dwell time and movement. Gasoline stations are positioned along projected corridors and also near five ways, placed ahead of demand, aligned with quiet knowledge of legislation moving toward an interstate system. Under the Ashford administration, these placements hold, backed by zoning shifts and access control that favour vehicle throughput. New suburbs take names that carry memory into the expansion. Robust South extends the city's reach, while John and Brother appear, fixed into the map as both development and reminder. Control begins to settle into physical form through infrastructure, the car, the road, the parking space, and the flow of fuel. Sound theatre is acquired and cleared, its facade stripped back and its footprint absorbed into a widening road bypass that feeds directly towards five ways, a decision justified as progress, though it quietly removes one of the last shared performing art spaces in town. But sound is determined to rebuild for a third time. At the same time, tension inside Mark's Industries reaches a breaking point, and after a series of disagreements over direction and control, the IBM factory moves in, replacing older production lines with a new kind of industrial presence tied to computation and federal contracts. The transition signals a shift away from wartime production toward controlled, contract-driven industry. Along the edges of this transition, diners multiply along the highways, motels rise beside them, and gasoline stations continue to fill every viable corner of the network, many of them tied back to Blainey holdings, positioned with precision along routes that still exist only on planning documents. The old dock begins to decline as freight shifts away from water and fully onto road and rail. Then in 1956, the Federal Aid Highway Act arrives and everything accelerates. The proposed Interstate I-70 alignment, stretching from Arizona to Chicago, becomes the single most important decision the city will face. And behind closed doors, Josiah Blainey moves quickly, influencing both the mayor and the governor to route it through Robust while bypassing Cedar Bluff entirely, following the old Winona track where land is already quietly being acquired. He argues for control, for positioning, for keeping Cedar Bluff stable and contained, even suggesting that an interstate into Cedar would bring change that Mr. Ashford may not want near his retirement, while Robust absorbs the movement instead. Interchanges are mapped aggressively, one of the largest placed directly over the black community of Freedman's Quarter, clearing land under the justification of access and efficiency, and in advancement of any public announcement, Josiah secures parcels along the entire corridor. Objections are raised, especially by Davenport, though they are absorbed into planning hearings and dismissed under the language of efficiency and regional necessity. Entire communities are displaced in the process, their removal recorded as numbers rather than names. At the center of it, he builds Scale, the largest gasoline, parking, and diner complex in the Midwest, anchored to what will become the Josiah Blainey Interchange, a name that fixes itself into both map and memory. Alongside this, he opens a Studebaker dealership, signaling status as much as function, and for the first time the system is locked in, roads, fuel, land, and power all aligned under a single direction. By the late 1950s, the restructuring turns inward, targeting districts that had been left behind by earlier expansion. The Bartram district is marked for renewal through mayor channels, though the plans read more like clearance than improvement. Entire blocks of social housing scheduled for removal, replaced by a new arterial cutting westward toward Prairie Junction, a direct link designed to feed traffic into the growing highway network. Streets are redrawn, parcels consolidated, and displacement becomes part of the planning process. In Henderson, a new Catholic school opens, funded through local and church backing, drawing families and reinforcing a different kind of community structure, something that does not align with Josiah's vision of control through systems, but to him it meant keeping the Irish out of the state elementary schools. And in response, land is secured and a Baptist Bible college and school is established closer to the expanding corridors, positioned with intent, another institution tied into influence rather than faith alone. Near the old Blainey homestead, a longtime citizen, Butler, moves ahead with a historical museum, collecting documents, land deeds, and records of the town's formation, turning memory into something that can be studied, and in doing so uncovers a land title discrepancy in favor of Henderson and Davenport. Butler wants to pursue it, but not everyone at the society is comfortable with it being pursued further because it seems that just knowing a Blainey can simply get you killed, so it is quickly filed away, leverage for another time. While Josiah won't do Henderson any favors, he does realize the strong admiration for Davenport and decides to keep Davenport on his side for now. A new motorway segment is named for the recently deceased Joseph Davenport, fixing the family into the network permanently, while state-backed funding is directed towards a new South High School placed within the expanding suburbs where William Davenport now attends. By the end of the decade, the tone shifts again, quieter, heavier, shaped by something that doesn't fully appear on the surface. The Cold War settles unannounced over Robust in layers. A civil defense bunker is constructed beneath the city, tied into the same network that now controls utilities and communication, while fallout shelters are marked across schools, basements, old halls, and public buildings, small signs that people try not to look at for too long. The airfield expands beyond its original footprint, extended runways and dual-use facilities linking civilian and military readiness, with a radar and communications tower rising nearby, scanning constantly, feeding information outward. An emergency broadcast station is integrated into the new radio system, capable of overriding everything at once, and across the highway network, evacuation routes are formally designated, signs placed along exits that had only just been built. To the edge of all of this sits Area 12, a restricted zone fenced off beyond the outskirts, guarded without explanation, connected quietly to the bunker system below and the airfield above. It is spoken about in fragments, about storage, testing, something federal, something not meant to be understood locally. At the same time, water reservoir expansion pushes capacity outward, framed as growth, though placed with the same strategic logic as everything else, survival built directly into the system. It is young, adventurous Edward Blainey who crosses into that layer by accident, or maybe something else, drawn by the fencing that he sees, by the silence around it, by the fact that no one will explain what sits inside Area 12. He finds a way through, a gap, a moment, and sees enough to understand that it is not just storage, corridors below ground, or sealed doors, movement that doesn't match anything else in town. He doesn't get far before he is stopped, detained, and processed through a system that moves faster than it should for a boy, his name triggering recognition in places it shouldn't reach. When Josiah is called about the arrest, Josiah doesn't argue it. He redirects it, pulls Edward out before it becomes something permanent, and brings him back into the only place he can control, his own household. The decision sits against everything else, against Edward's parents, Patrick and Clara, whose failures as parents are now visible in the way Edward moves. He's restless, he's unsupervised through town, always looking for trouble and looking for answers in the wrong place, so they lose custody. Josiah takes him in without ceremony, folding him into the structure he has built, but making Theodore jealous at the same time that the house now has two boys, while outside, smaller shifts continue to settle in. The Marek Kowalski workshop expands on the edge of the industrial zone, blending automotive work with something less visible, tied to an industrial expansion lot that feeds into arms and manufacturing contracts, and around it, a private security presence begins to appear, controlled access, guarded compounds, another layer added quietly to the city. Robust is preparing, and not everything being built is meant to be seen. By 1959, the Cold War is no longer distant. It sits inside the planning of the city itself. Through his dealings with the feds, through what was agreed in the aftermath of Caleb, Josiah is given access to information that does not reach the public or the council. His involvement in resolving the Caleb and Lucia situation, combined with his growing control over fuel and transport infrastructure, positioned him as someone the state could use rather than challenge. You may want to call Josiah a state spy, but really you should call him a useful civilian asset. Area 12 is not empty land. It is tied into buried utility corridors, hardened power controls, protected communications, and sealed storage designed for continuity under attack. Supplies are held there without labels, fuel reserves, equipment, materials that are never listed in town records, all positioned to keep systems running if everything above ground fails. Josiah understands it immediately as leverage. What runs underground determines what survives above ground, and he has already placed himself across the surface points, the interchanges, the fuel, the parking, the access routes that connect directly into those hidden systems. He moves carefully after that, investing where it aligns. Stakes are taken in Mark's Industries and the IBM facility, both tied into federal contracts and production chains that feed into the same Cold War structure. Land around Area 12 and along the interstate corridors is secured through quiet purchases, reinforced through zoning decisions that pass without resistance under the Ashford administration. His position, his name, and his marriage place him inside rooms where routes are discussed before they are announced, where infrastructure is decided before it is drawn, and where information moves faster than the public can follow. The part of Robust he controls begins to accelerate ahead of the rest. Service stations, parking systems, logistics corridors, all feeding into a network that he knows will be prioritized if pressure of the Cold War ever truly comes. At the same time, something shifts in how Josiah sees the world. The Cold War is not abstract to him. It is planning logic. It is contingency. It is about control and survival. The presence of Marek Kowalski operations in town, the movement of their weapons, the rumors of foreign interest and internal threats all sit within the same frame. He trusts very little, he watches everything, and he builds accordingly, tightening his influence over systems that cannot be easily replaced if they are taken out. Robust grows around him, outward, upward, faster than it ever has, though beneath it another structure already exists, one he did not create, but one he now truly understands, and one he is positioning himself to command if the moment ever comes. And in a world preparing for another war, the man who controls the system may decide how that war reaches the city. Robust is Josiah's, and there's nothing you can do about it.